When the first shots of the American Civil War were fired upon Fort Sumter on April 12, 1861, an army 200,000 strong was already awaiting the call from their leader to defy the wishes of the U.S. government, take up arms, and mount a major invasion. This army had soldiers and agents stationed across the country, from New York City to San Antonio. For years they had been fed a rhetoric of expansionism, violence, and fraternity that preyed upon masculine fears in an age of ever-changing culture. Above all, though, these soldiers were promised a chance to, quote, help direct the events of the age. But these were not new enlistees in the Army of the Confederate States of America. They were warriors for the Knights of the Golden Circle, and their target was not the United States, but Mexico. Hello everyone, my name is Mitch, and welcome to another exciting episode of the History Today podcast. And by another, I mean the first, and by exciting, I mean, well, that's for you to judge. Anyway, this is the podcast episode of kind of my channel, and I'm going to be uploading this onto YouTube, as well as a couple other platforms for podcasts. So I'm going to kind of structure it differently than my other episodes on this channel. Obviously, it's going to be a little bit longer, but I'm going to kind of talk about the podcast, then move on to the subject of today's episode, which is the Knights of the Golden Circle, which is a very fascinating subject. And then I'm going to, at the very end, I'm going to try and talk about what I kind of want to do for the channel, just since this seems like it's probably the best opportunity I have. So I'm going to put that at the end, though, so if you don't care about my channel as a whole, you can just skip all that. But really, the podcast is just going to be kind of longer and a little bit different. It's going to be meant to be more of a discussion, a little bit more casual in a sense. I hopefully will be able to bring on some friends or historians and to kind of talk about their work and some interesting topics of history. But it's also going to be kind of sometimes more lecture-based. So just kind of me reading off of some kind of notes that I have and on some really fascinating subjects. So I'm going to do that and then move on to the actual episode. And hopefully you enjoy it. The benefit to watching it on YouTube as opposed to listening to it on iTunes or something else would be that for quotes, which I pull a lot of quotes from on this episode, I'm going to put them kind of up here and on the screen, and then some images will also be there. But if you don't really care about that, then you can just listen to it on whatever you want. So without further ado, let's talk about the Knights of the Golden Circle. So the Knights of the Golden Circle, or the KGC, it was a paramilitary organization that masqueraded as a secret society. Paramilitary means that it's something that's kind of basically an organization of people that don't really have any valid authority given by the government or the state, but nevertheless they take up arms and use violence as a means to intimidate people. So, for example, before World War II, before the Nazi Party became the main party of the state of Germany, they were essentially a paramilitary organization, or they had a paramilitary arm for their party. These were the people who were going around in their uniforms, even though they weren't actual German soldiers. They made their own uniforms, and they were using violence to intimidate people from the other parties. So paramilitary just kind of means that, and you see a lot of these organizations popping up in the United States and actually also in Europe in a lot of the 1800s. So the KGC, though, was first established in 1854 by a guy from Indiana, actually. His name was George Bickley, and the first and foremost purpose of the KGC was to invade Mexico and parts of the Caribbean, to annex them to the United States and create a golden circle, is what they called it, of slaveholding states. That way, slavery would be too strong to ever be destroyed by free soil encroachment on the western frontiers. So until recently, really, historians haven't really paid much attention to not only the Knights, but also other paramilitary groups and Copperheads in general during the Civil War era. But Copperheads is a term that was coined during the Civil War, and it was used to describe Northern Democratic congressman, or really any congressman who was working to kind of undermine Lincoln's authority and bring an end to the war, oftentimes by any means necessary, even if it meant that they would allow the Confederacy to secede. So more modern historians, though, have kind of talked about these groups and Copperheadism as really a real credible threat to the Union, rather than just a political boogeyman that was created by Republican presses. They've looked at how the Southern Democratic Party developed paramilitary arms in the post-war period, but they've rarely looked at these arms, which drew on both free and slave state recruits from before the war. So the overlap between secret societies and paramilitarism is a crucial feature of antebellum or pre-war political culture. The Knights themselves were not necessarily dangerous because of their numbers or whether or not they explicitly helped push the South towards secession, but they're rather important because they championed white supremacist ideals by channeling the popularity of secret societies into pro-slavery paramilitarism. They were formed in a period that was widely being considered a golden age of secret fraternities, but founder George Bickley's writings reveal that the kind of mentality from which the Knights emerged was distinct within this overall trend. As millions of men joined these secret societies, Bickley formed his own, through which he could promote a violent goal by building an army of seduced soldiers. In his words, that goal was, quote, "the invasion of Mexico by a new and vigorous race, the overthrow of old social systems, and the establishments of new ones." By this, the Knights sought to use manifest destiny to open new opportunities for slavery. In 1859, Bickley and the other heads of the Knights wrote a pamphlet for the organization titled Rules, Regulations, and Principles of the KGC. It was to be mailed to potential members so that they could form their own lodge or castle. So it was basically a how to build your own extremely racist, violent military group. 101 for dummies. And I got a copy of it and I flipped through it, and that's kind of the basis of the research and where I pull out these quotes from. So within it are a bunch of documents, and they range from kind of a general proclamation to the constitution of the order and ritual instructions for 3 degrees of secret membership. They use this pamphlet to further their ultimate goal of protecting Southern civilization from abolitionist attacks by establishing the South as the cornerstone of a grand empire that was rooted in slavery. Each knight swore that quote, "should my state or any other Southern state be invaded by abolitionists, I will muster the largest force I can and go to the scene of the danger," end quote. So, while this pamphlet can really only serve as a snapshot of the organization's objectives at a single point in time, the ideas and themes articulated embody the violent political thought that would shape a generation of pro-slavery Americans. And I argue that with the rules, regulations, and principles of the KGC pamphlet, the Knights harnessed the popularity of secret societies to advance a culture of violent paramilitarism that was founded upon the creation and security of a slave-holding American empire. They did this in a couple of different ways. They did this first by promising a place in society to a disillusioned demographic of young men. They pushed nationalism and violence as means for modernization and social change. And finally, they structured their military agenda on the basis of racism. So the construction and the issuing of the Knights pamphlet came at the end of the Market Revolution and the dawn of the Industrial Revolution. A lot of people already know what the Industrial Revolution was, but not many people know about the Market Revolution, and in some ways it's kind of fallen out of use by historians, but I think it's still applicable here, at least in a general sense. So the Market Revolution really occurred kind of in the first third of the 1800s, and it transformed a lot of the economic, social, and cultural institutions by bringing in the system and making it popular of wage labor. So it was basically all about connecting people to the market through new canals or new roads or even railroads later on would allow people in the most remote places to suddenly ship their goods across miles that they couldn't do before and suddenly engage in a broader economic market that they couldn't reach before. But the problem with this is that everything became more specialized, and this eroded kind of old economic identities that people had, like apprentices. So new emerging ideologies seemed to replace the values of republicanism with an obsession on production and commerce. And for many Americans, this transformation highlighted the deep conflicts in American society itself, and the KGC would prey off of this. Now, most middle-class white men were becoming increasingly attached to the broader economy, and at this time, the market was extremely volatile, so it would fluctuate almost randomly. So this pulled their emotional energies away from their domestic lives and attached it to a kind of national or at least regional economy. So people respond to these changes in a variety of ways, and often they kind of formed groups based on counterculture. Now, it's not the hippies or the anti-war protesters of the 1960s, but this was a different kind of counterculture. For a lot of guys, constant rough activity and resisting pressures to conform to middle-class standards offered them the opportunity to prove their bravado and find fellowship amongst other men. They harnessed these popular notions as they promoted their order, the Knights did, as a way to find place amongst other respectable men, while providing a way to express violent desires in a political outlet. So, seeking to capitalize on such uneasiness, Bickley strategically chose to begin his pamphlet with a proclamation to prospective members whom he called idle, poor, and, quote, sickly from want of labor. Yet he, at the same time, called them ambitious, industrious, and patriotic. So, on one hand, he's recognizing their issues, their anxieties, that these men want to be part of this new market economy. They want to engage with their labor, and they want to take possession of what they can control. But at the same time, and they've been failing to do that. They're sickly from wanting it. But he's saying that, you guys are ambitious, industrious, and patriotic at the same time, morphing all those different social, economic, and political identities into kind of one notion. So, in reaction to the changing economic and social landscape, Bickley and the Knights played to fears of modernization by offering control of it. According to their proclamation, the KGC offered white men, quote, new fields of industry and enterprise, the quarry from which to hew out the statue of your own fortunes, end quote. The KGC was trying to offer these men a way to take charge and create their own identity, albeit one that fit within their boundaries. And this is not uncommon. Like I said, a lot of men feel like they're floating around in this kind of new age and they don't really know where they fit in, and secret societies and fraternities and social clubs were popping up all over the place to give these men a place to feel like they have control. But Bickley and the Knights were channeling that in a much different and more dangerous way. In fact, one of the main ways that the KGC defined itself was in terms of whom they deemed fit for membership. Article 42 of the KGC's Laws of the American Legion prohibit, quote, admitting drunkards or low and vicious characters to membership. So fraternal orders took on a different appearance during the 1840s, as they were first sold as social institutions, appealing to more respectable men to fit within middle-class ideals. So things began really with the Freemasons. Everyone's kind of heard of them, and they're still around today. And those were founded well before the KGC were. But over time, they kind of started a trend where more and more people were joining these, and they were kind of being seen as less than ideal candidates or savory sorts. So the Knights wanted to make sure that they didn't allow any drunkards or low and vicious characters in. But what you also see is that they don't want any Catholics, any abolitionists, anyone who wasn't a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, because that's what they believed America should be. Similarly, on those lines, Article 44 of their Laws of the American Legion states that membership is restricted to those who are, quote, over 19 years of age, white, sound of body and of mind, of good moral character, and under 50 years of age. So in this, you see them explicitly targeting younger men, whom the Knights hoped that they could mold into their image. So no matter how violent their ultimate goals were, here the Knights worked within popular trends to a certain extent, as they attempted to portray themselves as offering a place amongst the bourgeois class, and they forbid the admission of any irreputable figures. Bickley and the other leaders of the KGC sought to establish an army of respectable, industrious, and ambitious young men who had been previously displaced or disillusioned by changing notions of labor and masculinity as well. The Knights feared for the future of American men, whom they thought were becoming, quote, feminine in body and often brutalized in mind. They saw this as a result of having grown up in a prosperous period and not being raised as they believed sons should. Where have we kind of heard those kinds of feelings before? In the eyes of many Americans, the issue was not simply that the father was away working for wages in offices and factories more often, but more that women were taking an increasing role in the raising of the young boys. Bickley and the KGC asked these people directly, quote, young men, what have you to gain by this work? But what work were they talking about? Well, for the Knights, that work was their planned invasion and conquest of Mexico. To the Knights, the great teacher of how young men should be and the ideal form of masculinity would not be the mother or even the father, but the one who would teach them what it meant to be a man would be the KGC itself and their war. For the Knights, the answer to this plight of white masculinity in the future lay in these notions of labor and violence. Words such as boredom, restlessness, and longing were becoming increasingly popular amongst white men in the 19th century. You didn't really hear anyone to call themselves bored before that, and now it's, something we use every single day. I mean, I feel like I'm bored if I'm sitting for longer than 30 seconds without my phone. But the Knights incorporated these words and other colloquialisms into their rhetoric to show a contrast between what they offered and what the world provided. Mechanical references litter their writing to attract young men whom the KGC called, quote, industrious, to move the machinery of the Legion. So in order to attract these industrious young men, the KGC promised that every man enlisted would receive 640 acres of land that would be forcibly taken from the people of Mexico. For those who felt displaced by the emergence of wage labor and the new market economy, the KGC proclaimed, quote, to every man, you have the right to the fruits of your toil only. But these industrial-oriented goals were mixed with racist notions, as said rights extended only to white men, and they would be taken at the expense of people of color. In the eyes of the Knights, their southern neighbors had, quote, cursed the land with every vice from gambling to murder, and therefore were unfit to occupy the land that could otherwise be worked by white Americans. But more importantly, the Knights promised, quote, to force Mexicans into positions of labor, that their bodies and minds might be developed better to employ them under discipline. So the future, as the KGC saw it, lay in industry combined with the enslavement of races that they deemed lesser. They hoped that not only would white men improve the land taken at the expense of Mexicans, but that they would force the conquered people into slavery. The Knights planned to ensure such labor promises through the use of their highly organized military bureaucracy, with their own articles of war featured within the pamphlet itself. So alongside their kind of rhetoric of industry, violent rhetoric was the second way that the Knights sought to solve their perceived plight of white masculinity and constituted their primary method of preparing members for battle. Soldiers, the orders officers proclaim in the very first line of the pamphlet. Quote, "The time approaches when we must take the field. We have much to do. While we are strong, we must be stronger." The KGC was formed during an age in which, as Stephen Hahn argues, political power grew out of the barrel of a gun. And the rules, regulations, and principles of the KGC promoted a war against people whom the Knights not only saw as unfit to govern themselves, but also as a stain on their European ancestry, Latin Americans. Rallying young men to their cause, the Knights wrote that they, quote, "must meet them but to conquer. All civilization is the fruit of war." The Knights applied their violent rhetoric toward a very real and physical goal of invading Mexico, and, as events changed within the United States, eventually the North. Their pledge to, quote, "carry forth our civilization and plant the Anglo-Saxon race everywhere in the earth and Americanize Mexico," was not merely a planned conquest of culture, but one that would allow slavery to expand and thrive. To justify all of this, the Knights loaded their pamphlet with arguments that were designed to work around treason and instead evoke a sense of nationalistic pride in their audience. The KGC told its soldiers that their flag is glorious and that you can and should keep it so. They attempted to appeal to traditions that they said lay at, quote, "at the very bottom of American independence and national integrity." The pamphlet discusses the great nationalistic principles that were held by men like Daniel Webster, Henry Foote, and, curiously, Jefferson Davis, the future president of the Confederacy. Forebodingly, though, the Knights held that above all, the principle that these Knights held above all others was the, quote, "right to denationalize himself and become a citizen of any other nation, and when once there, he has the unquestionable right to rebel against the existing government and attempt to establish a new government." What this really meant was filibustering. Now, in the 19th century, filibustering didn't mean standing up in front of a bunch of people and delaying some votes by talking for hours and hours and hours, or reading How the Grinch Stole Christmas and Dr. Seuss while you delay. Filibustering was exactly what the Knights wanted to do. Going into another country, invading it, annexing it, declaring yourself the leaders of it, and bringing it in to expand the country that you came from. So what they're talking about here is the idea of filibustering, but they're talking about it in a very curious way. Denationalizing someone else, becoming a citizen of another country, rebelling against an existing government to try and establish a new government. All these things would kind of be mixed up in the Confederate States' argument for their right to secede from the United States. So really, the Knights were trying to say, though, that it couldn't be treason if it was in the best interest of the United States. I mean, treason, today would be treason if you go in and say, "I'm invading you on behalf of the U.S. government." But back then, there wasn't really a formal legal definition of treason. Instead, it was more kind of custom and kind of regional definitions, kind of circumstantial definitions that defined if you committed treason or not. And obviously, the idea of treason was still really not embedded or firm, because people rebelled against the U.S. during the Civil War and said that they weren't committing treason. But more importantly, in this, that you see the crucial link between the antebellum in the Civil War nights, as filibustering turned into secession. This link can be really seen in how the Knights sold themselves and marketed themselves. Bickley knew that in order to attract impressionable young members and push their agenda, the Knights had to market themselves around cultural changes, make them cool, in a sense. In terms of audience interests, Bickley wrote that, quote, "What was very excellent in 1800 may not now be the most desirable." Excellent advice. You don't see people walking around carrying Walkmans anymore, or even iPods anymore. So marketing that wouldn't really fly. And so it's interesting to try and think about what they thought was popular or trendy or hip, cool back in the 1850s. That wasn't cool in the early 1800s. They would actually go on to revise their rules and pledges numerous times toward a more overtly pro-secession stance as ideas of secession became more and more fashionable. So following these changes in how they wrote their rules and how they wrote their initiation things, you can see how their audience mutated in time. It went from targeting all anti-free soil or people who are anti-slavery, pro-slavery Americans, and all impressionable young men, and changed into targeting Copperheads, fire eaters, and Confederates. In doing so, in making this change, they placed their political allegiance behind the guise of enticing ritual and mystery that drew curious young men to secret societies in the first place. Historian Frank Clement argues that, quote, "patriotism and nationalism bred an intolerance that cried out for vengeance." Although initially put in place for use against Mexico, these rules got their first use against the U.S. in the Civil War, when many Knights viewed themselves as Confederate citizens first, and the U.S. as a foreign agitator. Therefore, even in 1859, 2 years before the Civil War started, the rules, regulations, and principles of the KGC provided justification for secession, and created a prepared military bureaucracy all behind the veneer of an enticing secret society. Yet the Knights' goal and structure in the South was not designed to continue into the war, and the Civil War would prove to be the first and last war fought by the KGC. As KGC members enlisted in the Confederate Army, they took with them the training and racially charged political zeal of the Knights, but ultimately this came at the expense of the order. Later on, to compensate for and combat the progressive policies brought about by the war, namely emancipation and voting rights for African Americans, many whites rallied together through post-war secret societies. KGC members left the Knights, essentially, and when they joined the Confederacy, but following the Civil War, they kept those ideas and saw what a secret society was capable of and made some interesting tweaks. The Civil War era did not only produce major changes in the political definition of the United States, but rather it produced rapid changes in the social constructs of young men. These young men, seduced by the secretive KGC, would become members, read the rules, regulations, and principles, and be indoctrinated into an army that sought to use military organized violence to promote racial oppression and political change. With notions of masculinity shifting and ideas of social standing tied to memberships in organizations, the Knights of the Golden Circle combined the tradition of secret societies with overtly racist rhetoric to create a template for post-war paramilitary organizations. And I think it's really curious that the Ku Klux Klan curiously takes part of their name, Ku Klux, from the Greek word for circle. I'm not saying there's a direct link there, but it's food for thought. Men had many reasons for joining the KGC, but perhaps the most appealing was the promise that the KGC would give one the quarry from which to hew out the statue of their own fortunes, as they said. But in the end, the KGC was hardly so enduring, and instead of a rich, beautiful circle of gold as they had sought, it would be a legacy of treason, racism, and violence that the Knights would leave etched in stone. So that is really the gist of the KGC. They were one of many filibustering organizations and groups, and there are insanely entertaining and fascinating stories tied to other filibustering organizations and people. But I'm not going to try and go into that here. I think the KGC stand out from those other filibustering organizations, though, because while those others were, going in might be invading some other Latin American country out of a racist ideal and seeking to add that to the United States, the KGC was really unique in that they wanted to add it to the United States to preserve slavery, to create a slavery system that was so strong that it can never be torn down. And although they never did invade Mexico, they massed a lot of troops on the Texas-Mexico border. In fact, they pulled most of their recruits from Texas just because the ideas were so popular there. So there's also the Kingston, the Golden Circle movie that just came out recently. I haven't seen it yet. I do want to see it, but I really like the first one. But I haven't gotten a chance to see the next one. I don't know if the Golden Circle that's mentioned there is the Knights of the Golden Circle, so maybe you guys can tell me if that's what they're talking about. Actually, I'm sure I'm going to go see it sometime soon, so I'll be able to check it out. So hopefully you enjoyed my discussion on the Knights of the Golden Circle. I think that they're extremely important in helping you understand, or helping anyone understand, this period. It wasn't just about racism and about creating a slaveholding society. It wasn't just about the new market economy and the Industrial Revolution. It wasn't just about kind of young men and white masculinity being so fragile and having a crisis of masculinity. It was about the KGC taking all of these factors going on in American society and culture and combining them to create a new organization that wanted to use violence to assert their political goals. So I just find that extremely fascinating. I know I use a lot of quotes. I won't be using as many quotes in future episodes, but this one was really just based on their own writings. I'm just kind of taking what they're saying and explaining it. So that's kind of what I want to do in some of my podcasts, talk about fascinating subjects, hopefully bring on some friends, like I said, and have some discussions and conversations about different historical topics. With the channel in general, I'm going to be trying to hopefully upload at least once a week. I have kind of 3 different episodes or types of shows I'm going to be trying to do. The podcast episodes, the history of fast facts, and then there's kind of my medium length episodes where I kind of cover smaller issues that might not be, or smaller topics that might not take an entire half-hour long podcast to cover, but that are still interesting nonetheless. So, hope you like it. If you are interested in history, if you are trying to study for exams, if you're just curious about history, go ahead and subscribe to my channel, YouTube channel. It's History Today. You can also follow me on Instagram at historia.today. I'll kind of link to that in the description. But thank you very much for watching, or if you are listening on iTunes or Google Play, thank you very much for listening. And I hope you have a great day, and thanks.